Good morning, everyone. We will start promptly at 10 o'clock, just so you know. Please make sure you just turn off your camera and mute your microphone if you are not the presenter or host. Thank you very much. And
Georgia, I just asked you a question. Why do they have to turn off their cameras?
it's just easier for participation and also so that way, if anything's being shared and stuff like that. But if you prefer to have them on, you can tell them to turn it on. It's up to you.
Okay, thanks.
Uh-huh. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Georgia. I'm going to be your host. I will be moderating the chat here. So if you have any questions, you can place them in the chat. And then also, we try to ask to have any questions saved to the end of the presentation. Other than that, I'm going to hand it right over to Andrea.
Thanks, Georgia. So I'm Andrea Gazaniga. I know many of you. I'm a professor of English, and I'm also the director of undergraduate studies in the English department. And I'm also the first teaching fellow for the CTL. So today I wanted to talk about discussion boards. And since I'm talking about discussion boards, it kind of makes sense for us to be discussion focused. So I thought to get us going, I would ask all of you to participate in a poll so we can get an idea of how each of us sort of conceives of discussion boards. So I have launched a poll. Choose one statement that best describes your experience with discussion boards. So some of this, I mean, a couple of them may apply to you already, but choose the one that seems best. Okay. I'm happy to see that not a lot of people are saying they're too much work. Okay. Oh, we got one. Yeah, and other. I know. Like I said, there's got to be one. I'll ask you, Maureen. I'll ask you what that other is. I always find the same thing when I get things like this, that there's got to be some other thing. Okay. All right. Well, so it looks like what we have is majority of people find them useful. Um, and sort of what I expected is that some found that they don't really fit well into your courses, and also that they don't generate good results. And that was really my experience with discussion boards when I first started to use them. So, I guess maybe 8 years ago, I probably would have picked they don't produce good results. But then I realized that they don't produce good results because I was conceiving of them all wrong, and I was packaging them in a way to students that wasn't producing good results. So just out of curiosity, if anyone feels like sharing from the people who said they don't produce good results, if anyone wants to share what experience you have with that, like what exactly are the results you're getting that you don't like, and you can just talk or write it in the chat.
So this morning, since I said other, I'm trying to engage the students with each other, and I want them to talk to each other
Yes.
online, and they don't. I mean,
Right.
they still go to me, and I used to say pre-pandemic, if you email me and it's a question for everybody, I'm posting it on Canvas, but that felt a little harsh in the pandemic, so I pushed back.
Yeah.
But I give extra. So one thing I'm missing in the discussion is they used to have it in Blackboard as the anonymous option. When we had anonymous, it was much more effective for my students, my classes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly sort of what I'm addressing here today, which is it doesn't feel like in a lot of my bad experiences with discussion boards, it doesn't feel like they're actually having a conversation.
Exactly.
Right. And so I'm just going to talk about how we can create a philosophy of conversation, communicating that to our students, but also some very specific assignment that I have that really forces conversation. Kimberly wrote that she requires students to reply to one another, but the comments seem forced. And that is exactly what my experience was when I had an asynchronous online class. And, I said, respond to this prompt and then respond to two other people. And the responses to the other people were just sort of useless. It was sort of like, whoa, that was a good job. That was a great idea. And they didn't really advance any kind of conversation or dig any deeper intellectually into the, into the material. So that is definitely something that kind of prompted me to develop a different approach to discussion boards. Poor peer engagement, Megan. Yes, totally. A lot of I agree, and that's about it. And it doesn't really get beyond, what's actually useful in a discussion board, which is that there is discussion. So this is really helpful just to get the measure of what's going on with everybody. And I think that I would say that the majority of us have similar experiences, though we do find them useful, right? In some ways. So I'm going to put this in context of very specifically my situation when I was teaching during the pandemic, and that was with online synchronous classes. So I was doing Zoom classes, and the Zoom classes were daunting at first because I didn't know if anyone was going to participate. I sort of imagined that there were a lot of students who, would have their cameras off, and so in an in-class situation, a way that I understand student engagement is by looking at their faces and seeing, are they thinking? Are they registering what's going on? And so I wanted to have a space where students could extend the conversation in our Zoom classes that would pull in those people who maybe were sitting there with their cameras off, but were actually really listening and really thinking, but wouldn't have the opportunity of me looking at them and going, Lisa, you look like you're thinking about something. What do you have to say? Which would be what I would do in a real class, right? And I'm sure a lot of us do this. We read their faces and we call on them because we know that they're thinking something. So the Zoom class prevents that kind of engagement of those quieter, introverted students. So that was one thing. So I wanted to figure out how I can create a discussion board space that would really bring those students in and give them an opportunity to talk. But also, I wanted to use the discussion board as a space for processing ideas and reflecting on class discussion. So, I mean, a lot of times I think we go in, we teach our 50 minutes, we walk out, and we just assume that, you know, there's no more thinking about those ideas. There's no space to sort of 2 hours later go, wait a second, I don't really understand when that person said that in class. Because I tell my students that I'm actually a really slow thinker and it takes me a long time to process. And so I wanted to have a space for them to go back and go, well, you know, what that person said in class really made me think some more, and I'd like to process it here. Um, so I wanted to have that kind of space. But I also wanted to leave a space for spontaneity, which is not something we really get when we're teaching online or in asynchronous online environments. So having a place where whatever happens in class, whatever emerges from class, we can all build on together and bring it into this other space that was outside of class, which I wouldn't know, you know, I wouldn't know what that would be until we were having discussions. And I'm going to give you a bunch of examples for this. Um, so and I'm going to talk about a really specific assignment that I have. And the specifics you may think are not compatible to, you know, what you're doing or what you want to do. But I really think that the big takeaway that we can have from this is kind of more about a philosophy, which is really embracing relinquishing control to our students, giving them more autonomy. Because I realized in the way that I developed these discussion boards for this particular class, and the way I packaged it and presented it to the students, that the more I stepped away from it, the more they stepped into it. So Maureen, it's kind of like that idea that they're always focusing on you, like they're always, you know, you're the audience, you're the primary audience. So I wanted to sort of take me away as the primary audience and make students the primary audience. And so I did that with a very specific assignment. So I'm just going to go into talking about that specific assignment. First, I think it's important for me to tell you the class that I use this for, because I think context matters here. So obviously it does, because I was teaching a class called Writers in Context. So Writers in Context is a class, it's a literature class, and it sort of approaches literature from a variety of disciplines. So we're talking about political, cultural, technological context. We're also talking about science. We're using all sorts of modes of knowing to learn about literature. And so my particular class was Victorian literature and visual culture. And the way that my class was set up was I was meeting 3 times a week on even weeks, and then I gave them the Friday off on the odd weeks because of Zoom fatigue. So this was how my class was set up. And I think that what I'm going to present to you is it's more in the context of, so what I learned from the pandemic, what am I going to continue? What I'm going to continue is I'm going to continue using discussion boards in my face-to-face classes in the way that I'm going to describe. But if you're teaching an asynchronous online class, I think that my assignment could very easily work in that kind of format as well. Okay, so let me share first the assignments that I used. So the first one is your sort of typical, that's not it, sorry. The first one is your typical sort of, you know, discussion post assignment. So, you know, here's, okay, I somehow am not having the, let's see if this is it. Okay. Sorry. Oh, here it is. I got it. Let me see. Okay. Sorry. 1 second. I'm going to shrink that, put that there. This is sort of, okay. Sorry. Oh, here it is. Okay. So this is your sort of typical assignment that we might have, which is discussion post. And then, I write out the guidelines. So I always put a purpose in my assignments. Discussion posts allow you to continue class discussion in a more focused and contemplative way. And I usually add a kind of personal anecdote to make it more human. I say, if you're like me, I think a million things during class discussions that I can only work out later after I've reflected on them. So these discussion posts allow you time to work out your ideas together. And this is where I kind of packaged it in a way that I hadn't normally done, which is to say, the discussion board is your space. You will be talking with your fellow classmates and not to me, though I will be eavesdropping. You will have designated moderators for each week who will respond to your ideas and pose follow-up questions. Please be sure to read what they say and answer their queries. So, even though I kind of, wanted it to be a more spontaneous space, obviously I still want it to be focused and structured. So I do have, basic requirements of word count, and things of that nature. But the way that I kind of made it a little bit different was with the discussion post moderator assignment. So with the discussion post moderator assignment, I'm sorry, I'm having so much trouble with this. Where did it go? Sorry, I had it all set up, right? That's what happens. Just a second. Okay. No. Okay. There it is. So with the discussion post moderator assignment, what I basically decided to do was to say, okay, we're going to have a discussion board, but I'm not going to moderate it. I'm not going to be the one who's responding to you. I'm not going to be the one who is, trying to further that conversation. It's really going to be all you. So what I did was I basically assigned 1 or 2 students per discussion board to act as me, or to act as I would, in a discussion board. So once again, with my assignment, I really laid out the purpose, which is to develop and practice the following skills. So synthesize and communicate complex ideas, generate productive discussion that advances knowledge, engage in a scholarly conversation, formulate thoughtful questions about texts, collaborate with peers on exploring and answering questions, and build a mutually respectful community of thinkers. So in sort of presenting the purpose that way, I'm really, again, kind of communicating that philosophy that we're not just kind of talking to me, we're actually doing something important with the ideas that we're engaging with. And so the basics of the assignment were that I would have a sign up sheet at the beginning of the semester, and for each discussion board, I would have 1 or 2 students act as the moderator, and they would sign up at the beginning of the semester. And they were responsible for responding to the ideas and arguments that were posted by their peers. So I said, think of yourself as a teacher. It's not enough to simply say, good idea, I agree with you, right, Megan? That's what we don't want, right? we want to engage them. I had them read a chapter from a really great book called They Say, I Say, which has a chapter on entering an online conversation. And basically, the idea is that because of technology and online reading, we sort of respond to things, but we don't repeat what we're responding to. So people have to sort of scroll up and find, what are you even addressing here? And the chapter gives some really good sort of formulaic kinds of ways to respond to people in a chat situation or a discussion board situation. And I gave them a similar formula. So I said, here's what you as a moderator should do. You need to restate the specific idea you're responding to and in what context it was said. You need to build upon that idea by adding something new. Okay. So I even said, you may write something like, if we consider X idea, then we can start to understand how X can explain Y. And students really, really latched on to that formula. And I saw it in all of the responses and even in the responses of students who weren't moderators. So those who weren't moderators sort of learned how to be in a conversation just in general, even though they weren't on for that week as a moderator. And then finally they pose a question that emerges from the new addition to the discussion. So the question then really advances the conversation. And for the grading, I made this a very sort of low stakes-ish kind of assignment because I felt like students would feel more liberated without the pressure of, having a certain word count that they have to use and, following a really specific rubric. I kind of wanted them to feel more liberated and spontaneous in that way. Okay, so that's the assignment. The results were actually pretty amazing. And I will show you, this is the book I was talking about, They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing, which is really, really useful. I highly recommend this book in general. But this statement, too many online exchanges end up being not true conversations, but a series of statements without clear relationships to one another. So that's like the guiding philosophy behind all this, is that we want real conversations. So this is an example of a prompt that I started off by giving them prompts, right? And the prompts were very specific. We're talking about Sherlock Holmes, social class. We're talking about, various ideas. And the prompts that I provided obviously elicited really smart, engaging ideas. And then as the class progressed, I realized, wait, I still have too much control over this. I need to pull back a little bit. And so I started doing things like just respond to our class discussions, anything you want. And what I got was, students who were hesitant to talk in class really jumping in. In this example, the student says, I'd like to discuss what others think of Monsieur Paul in Bronte's Villette. So far, I really don't like him. I find him overbearing and rude and super sexist. So obviously this person needed to get this off their chest. But she writes a pretty lucid response here, and then she turns and asks the question, right, to her fellow classmates, because she's conceiving of this space as actually a space for conversation. And so she asks this question and she gets responses, and, they sound sort of jargony, like, oh, these students are sort of not really, engaging deeply with material, but they actually are, because, she's talking about Bronte's track record. So she's referencing what she's learned about Charlotte Bronte. And she says, I can't help but think Lucy might be like brooding, grouchy dudes. So a little bit of humor always engages students a little bit more. And then someone responds to that and says, I still don't like Monsieur Emmanuel, even with him possessing most of the qualities we all typed in the class chat. And this is an interesting instance because this student was obviously engaged in the class chat. This particular student, I didn't even know if they were even paying attention. But when I'm reading this, I'm thinking, oh, well, actually, they are paying attention because they're referencing the class chat. And this, again, is another student that always has her camera off, and I never know if she's there. But she writes, like Alvina said in class, Lucy's character takes a shift. And so I realized, wow, this person is actually really engaged and is one of those people that I'm trying to capture here who doesn't really talk. And then as the conversation, and I say nothing in this, right? I say nothing in this. And as the conversation progresses, we get to the lesson that I would have wanted them to know, which is, well, he's good and bad, right? So they sort of arrived at that aha moment without me. And of course, there is a moderator there who's also responding to these things. So talking about spontaneity with the discussion prompts, I still came in and gave them a prompt like this one that gets to themes. But then, in one class, someone said Oscar Wilde was their soulmate, and they were all like, "Oh, who's everyone's soulmate?" And so I said, well, we'll put that in the discussion board. Who is your soulmate? And so the students had a lot of fun with that. But that's sort of what I mean, is kind of not thinking of discussion boards so strictly and kind of pulling back and letting them have a little bit of control. And finally, they were coming up with their own prompts. And so this is a prompt that they came up with, which is imagining that this character from one novel is dropped into the picture of Dorian Gray, and they're writing a scene or dialogue between these two characters. And that was all from our Zoom session. And they're like, wow, what would it be like if, what would it be like if Lord Henry was talking to Lucy? And someone said, we should write that. And I said, okay, let's do it. So they were really driving that towards the end. The final thing I want to talk about is, because I wasn't planning on talking this much, but the final thing I want to talk about is the student moderators. So this just blew my mind. When I gave them the task of being me, they just ran with it. And those moderators showed how they were responding to ideas. They were tactfully disagreeing while advancing the conversation. They were really demonstrating active listening. So this is an example of a response from a moderator. So Isabella, in your example, Watson personally finds the king's style to be tacky, but he still recognizes the clothing as a symbol of mighty wealth. Doyle uses dress as one avenue of depicting class status in his stories. You mentioned that Sherlock helps out others regardless of class, but I don't believe his motivation in doing that is a moral, empathetic one. So this person is demonstrating that she's listening to what the person wrote, and she's also adding new information to it. This is the same one who says, I agree it's difficult to discern how Doyle himself felt about the class system. But we are able to see how he represents characters of different class. So again, she's taking that formula of like, repeat what they say, but add something new. And clearly she's doing that here. Another one, I enjoyed your insight. As mentioned in Wednesday's discussion, and again, thinking about our sort of class conversations as not isolated and ending when the class is over, but extending into this other space that these students really own, and giving them an opportunity to further the conversation with questions. And what I also found was that they were so supportive of each other. So this is a moderator who says, I always enjoy reading your perspectives on the many poems and novels we read. I think you're very perceptive, and your contributions to our conversations are something I value very much. Now, if I had been the moderator, let's say, and giving feedback to students, that might be something that I would say. But I think that coming from their peers, it matters so much more in a weird way. And they kind of start to value the whole process of conversation when they're getting this kind of positive feedback from their own classmates. Now, I do give feedback to the moderators, and what I do, and I'm starting to do this with all of my classes in my feedback, is I'm always connecting it to career readiness. And so I'm very transparently saying to them, what you're doing is going to help in your career. And so this is this is an example of some feedback that I gave to a student who was moderating a session. And I said, the skills you just practiced in this particular activity will serve you so well in whatever career or work you choose. When advancing in your career, you should highlight your ability to synthesize seemingly disparate pieces of information or data in a cohesive, comprehensive way, and your ability to communicate that synthesis clearly and effectively. So I'm sort of saying to them, what you're doing here is actually really important for your advancement in whatever work you do, and you need to highlight that. So a lot of times people who are, English majors think, well, what can I do with that? And so here I'm saying, no, it's a skill-based idea. It's not a discipline idea, it's skills. Here's the skills that you need to highlight in your career. And so that's sort of what I'm doing with my feedback. That's kind of a separate issue, but okay, I'm going to stop sharing now. Are there any questions?
I'm just talking, Andrea. I'm going to ask a question.
I'm looking at the chat because I wasn't following the chat, so I don't know.
Well, the question I'm going to ask is this. Did you have any students who just totally fell apart? I mean, because what you described was really sort of loose, right? And I am responsive to that. What I'm wondering though is did you have a week where you had moderators that just didn't do it? Or
yes.
Okay, so can you talk a bit about that challenge and sort of how you addressed it, or sort of how that worked?
Well, I had student moderators who did fall apart, and there was a lot of stressors there involved. And basically I just reached out to them and said, hey, I noticed that you kind of dropped the ball on this. And I just gave them another opportunity to do it in another venue, and they stepped up and did it. I mean, I think that what we learned is a lot of stuff sort of got in the way of our students' lives. And I was just really sympathetic if someone dropped the ball. And I just gave them another opportunity. Now, towards the end of the semester, there were no opportunities, right? There were no opportunities because there were no more discussion boards. So what I ended up doing in that case was I had those people who still hadn't fulfilled that assignment. I had students in the class post their rough drafts of their final essay, and those students who didn't do the moderator assignment had to read those essays and give feedback on those rough drafts. So I kind of did a little improvising there, but that actually worked out really well. Yeah. So go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying, it looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat. Hillary asks, what are the students who are not moderators expected to do?
Yeah, so the students who aren't moderators are the ones who are posting. So they're the ones, responding to the prompt. And the moderators are the ones who are responding to those responding. What happened as we went into the semester was, because students knew there were going to be a moderator, they were even more careful of kind of practicing that kind of feedback, despite the fact that they weren't moderators. So I had a lot of discussion threads with people who aren't moderators who are actually sort of practicing that, that skill, I guess, because they felt more invested in it, because they were like, oh, I have to do this, so let me try it out. So the people who aren't moderators were just sort of engaging in the prompt and the conversation.
And then another question is, how do you grade the various roles?
Right. So I was talking about low stakes writing, right? So the people who were just responding to the prompt, it was like 10 points, right? It's in the grand scheme of things, that's not a lot, right? But I wanted them to feel like, well, I could do this, it's low stakes, basically. And so those people, if they posted, they just got those points. Now, the people who are moderators, again, I sort of presented it as effort. So, I said, if you responded to 2 people, that's kind of not a big effort, and that's more like a D. And I said, but if you're responding to over half the people, that's a good effort. That's an A. So like I said, I didn't have a really strict kind of rubric. But the people who did the moderating, all of them got A's except for the people who flaked, but then those people stepped up later.
All right.
Wait,
Let's. Okay,
yeah,
go
I
ahead.
see. Are other students still required to go beyond moderators? No, they're not, but they ended up doing it anyway because, again, it's that philosophy that the more I removed myself, the more they jumped in. And so even though they weren't required to respond beyond the moderators, they just started doing it anyway. And they just sort of had fun with that. Okay. Did students unfair if moderators had to do more work, but others got A as well? Did students feel it was unfair if moderators had to do more? I'm not sure I understand that question.
I'm sorry. I'm going to speak. I was having difficulty typing.
Okay.
So, the students who were chosen to be moderator had to do more work. And then others could kind of sit back and say whatever they want to say. So the moderators had to do more work. But at the end, if everybody, is getting A, did some students feel like it's unfair?
Well,
Like they have to do more work.
but everybody in the class is a moderator at some point.
Oh,
yes.
I see. I didn't realize that. Okay, I was wondering about how do you choose moderators?
Yeah, I'm sorry if I didn't
okay.
make that clear. Yeah, everyone in the class has to serve that role. Right. So they're all doing the same amount of work at some point. Yeah.
I see. So this is a pretty small class then.
It's 8. It was 18 students.
Okay.
So, but again, I was thinking like, what if you had an online asynchronous class and there's like 40 people in it? I still think you could manage having students be moderators, maybe like 5 of them. And the moderators were talking to moderators, it was sort of like,
how could you split up a class if you have, say, for example, you have 80 in the class, and I think this is a great idea. 80 students, how do you pick, how many moderators you're going to have for each week? And this is strictly online, so I love this idea, but how do you pick it? And how many would you need for each one if you had 80 students?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it would have to also depend on how you've structured your course. If you're going to have discussion boards every week, then let's say you have 14 and, you have 80 students and whatever that math is, because I'm not a math person. So, you could divide it up that way. So you could actually have like 5 moderators per discussion post, which I think would work. Yeah, Tanya?
Yeah, I'm just going to throw out an idea for how one could do it in a large class. And this actually goes back to a class I TA'd for in graduate school, but it was a large lecture style course, but the professor really valued having actual discussions in class. And so basically what she did, and this was a class of probably, I don't know, something like 75 students. And so she broke the class into 3 groups of 25, and 25 students each week were on for discussion. So basically, the way that it worked was that not everyone discussed every single week, but every 3rd week you were in that on group.
Right.
And I think you could do something similar using Canvas discussion boards, and that would also sort of make it more manageable for the instructor. If
Yes.
you were doing a large online course, I mean, that would be the way that I would personally approach it. And then you could even do quizzes on those discussion boards or something like that, that the other students could sort of show they were engaged with the discussion, even if they weren't participating
Right,
or
right. Yeah.
moderating.
Yeah, I think that's a good solution. And I'll say that one thing I learned with using this was I would have I sort of talked about how I had these really structured prompts, and then all of a sudden the students were sort of taking over and writing their own prompts. And I think if you had a large class and you had them sectioned into groups, you could give those groups the task of writing up together, collaborating and writing up, a prompt based on the material for that particular week. Um, and so that would be another way that, even though they're working in a group situation, they're sort of invested in running that discussion board because they've come up with the prompt together. Um, so yeah. Is the moderator feedback seen by all students like a comment? Yes. Yes. So it's they're just sort of adding to the thread, right? Um, and so people can see that comment, and they're also asking questions so that people can respond to the questions that the moderators. And a lot of students would post something, the moderator would respond and ask a question, and then the student would come back and continue, with answering that question. Any other questions? Yeah, brooding, grouchy dudes. That's awesome. And that's what I also liked about it is, I mean, in English, obviously we teach like, written communication, and oral communication, but giving them a kind of space where they could say things like that. But I mean, they're still learning, right? But they're talking as they would talk, and it kind of brought the literature alive even more, giving them that space to talk like real people about how, the realness of literature. So talking about a 19th century figure in a 19th century novel in that way makes me happy because it means that it's still alive. So I welcomed that kind of jargon, actually. I don't require students to respond back to questions posed by peers. And the reason why is because then that started to feel like that trap of post, respond twice, that kind of bean counting sort of approach that I think doesn't generate as good of a conversation. So yes, some students didn't, and that's fine. But I was sort of sacrificing that for the joie de vivre of a kind of, open conversation without these really strict measurements. So they just need to respond once through. Yes. So if you're doing the prompt, you just had to do your prompt. Now, that's not to say that I did have a citizenship grade in the class, and I did make it clear that, the more engaged you are, the more that will reflect well on your citizenship. And of course, the citizenship idea comes from my colleague, Tanya Kraus, who brilliantly imagined that, we should measure participation in different ways. So yes, they received credit, but they could supplement their citizenship grade by being even more sort of vocal and engaged in the discussion boards. Dr. Bailey.
Hi, I'm actually Becky. I just used Dr. Bailey.
I just read what was there. It says Dr. Bailey raised hand.
I'm really curious because coming from history, one of the ways we break down sort of the dialogic power of the professor is to invite students to reflect or comment. So I'm wondering what kinds of comments or feedback have you received from students about the career readiness component? Because I think that is just a wonderful idea.
You know, I'll just talk specifically about that one student. When I wrote that, I wonder if I could pull it up. When I wrote that comment to her, she emailed me, in fact, and said, "Thank you so much for saying that. I never really thought about it as a kind of skill I'm developing for a career." So she actually wrote to me, like thanking me for alerting her to that, right?
Mhm.
And I think that students respond really well in class when I'm talking to them and I'm presenting an assignment to them, and I vocally say to them, look, in a career, you're going to have to do this and this and this and this. And this assignment is developing those skills, XYZ, that you can apply to this job or that job. And I get, I get kind of specific about it, but they respond really well to it. At least judging from, their facial expressions when I can see those who actually have their cameras on. I've only started doing it since the pandemic, so I'm excited to get into the classroom and be even more deliberate about doing that. Actually, I was in a class once, and it was a capstone class for our major, and I did write on the board like skills you've developed as a major and skills that are required, that are useful in jobs and all this kind of stuff. So I actually did that in class, but they respond really well. And I'm just going to keep doing it.
And for what it's worth, I just think that might be something to do a reflection so that perhaps you, because I think this could be great scholarship.
Mm-hmm. No,
for-
that's yeah. And there, I can't remember. There's now people who are basically putting that as a component in their syllabi,
Mhm.
which is a career ready portion of the syllabi. So we have our student learning outcomes, right?
Right.
But then translating those student learning outcomes into career ready language, which at some point I'm going to do as well.
It looks like we have another, actually a two-part question. What about the students' perception about this learning experience? What are the strengths and weaknesses of adopting this approach?
Right. So the student perception about this learning experience. And so before I gave this talk, okay, I'm going to admit something. I rarely read my evaluations because I'm so scared of them. I think a lot of us have, since earning tenure, kind of read them intermittently, but I did go back and read the ones for this particular class. And there wasn't an exact reference to this particular assignment, but I did get a lot of comments that were like, she created a really positive environment for learning. She made everyone feel comfortable to speak. And we always felt like we were learning from each other. Those kind of comments, I think, were speaking not just to obviously the Zoom class, but I think that particular assignment and creating that space for them to own. I think that those comments were in part coming from that experience. The strengths and weaknesses of adopting this approach. I think one of the weaknesses is something that I think Tanya asked, which is you might have people who just flake. And so what do you do? What's the backup plan? If you run out of time in the semester where they can't do that assignment, they're just going to fail. And so, I kind of was a little spontaneous in solving that problem. But you might want to have a kind of backup plan for, well, what happens when students flake on this assignment? How can they fulfill something similar so they at least have a chance for earning those points? And I think the strengths are that they were talking, they were having a conversation with each other. They were seeing learning as a kind of fun and spontaneous endeavor that doesn't end when a class ends, but can extend on. And they're also learning, like I said, how to synthesize, how to communicate, all those things that we have to do in our professional lives. They're learning how to do in a very prescriptive sort of, way. So I think that is definitely one of the strengths. Yeah. Yes.
All right. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, that's a good one, Megan. And of course, like the idea of the discussion board is that, it's all of us having this conversation. And so going back is kind of defeating the purpose, but it's better than nothing, right? That would be sort of better than nothing. And it might actually show those students that they missed out on a lot of great talking. And so they might actually feel like, oh, darn, I really missed out on this fun conversation. So, yeah. Okay. Anything else?
All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Andrea, for presenting.
Thanks.
A lot of great information here. Please, we have about almost a 12-minute break here. So our next session is going to start at 11 a.m. and it's going to be a nice split session from 11 to 11:25. And then our next session will be 11:30 to 12. All right. Hope to see you all there. Thank you.